Hello, historians. Welcome to On This Day in History, your daily insight to what's happened in the past and how it has influenced the events of the present. On this day, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So, here's a short look at what happened on this day, the 17th of June. So, on this day in 1789, in the French Revolution, some have often marked this date as the official beginning of the French Revolution. During the meeting of the Estates General, the Third Estate proclaims itself the National Assembly. What this meant was they had declared that they stood for the people, they stood for the country, and they were going to dictate the direction of the country going forward, not the king and not the aristocrats, not the wealthy, not the upper crust. It was going to be a country of the people. Quite a significant event. And funnily enough, it just so happens on this day in 1885, as a gift from the nation of France for the 100th anniversary of the end of the Revolutionary War and the beginning of the nation of America, to mark the 100 years of friendship between France and America, and of course, because France had been a powerful and useful ally to the Americans uh, in the American Revolution, they were given the gift of the Statue of Liberty. So the Statue of Liberty was actually built and designed in France and shipped across in pieces. And this is a rare picture. You can imagine in 1885 photographs not exactly as common as they are today. And this is a rare picture of the face of the Statue of Liberty before it has been all put together. Now that Statue of Liberty, Statue of Freedom, became symbolic of immigrants coming to America, especially in the first half of the 20th century, the early 1900s. And quite ironic that it itself is an immigrant. It's perhaps the most enduring symbol of the United States of America, and it was brought in as a gift from France. Quite ironic given the current environment we live in. Anyway, also sticking with the French theme, in 1939 they had the last public guillotining in France. So the guillotine, which was made famous by the French Revolution, was still used as a form of national execution all the way up until 1939, when it was last used outside the prison Saint Pierre in Versailles. So lucky Eugen Weidmann, the very last person to be guillotined in France. A lot more recent than you may have expected. In 1976, the ABA merges into the NBA. Now, this was quite a significant occurrence for not just the NBA, obviously, and not just for basketball, but for professional sports generally. Now, what happened was there were two rival leagues. There was the NBA, the National Basketball Association, and the ABA, the American Basketball Association, and there were two competing leagues. Now, the NBA had been established in the 1940s, the ABA only in the late 60s. Now, one of the reasons that the ABA had been established as a rival, and one of the things that they did, was they were a bit looser, a little bit more progressive in with their rules and implementation. For example, you could go straight from high school to the ABA. That was not the case with the NBA at the time. And they didn't necessarily recruit from colleges, they recruited the best talent. Now, that did mean they had players coming from college, of course, but they also had overseas players coming in. They had players, like I said, coming straight from high school, free agents, all of these things, which meant the ABA actually, just by happenstance and circumstance, ended up having far higher percentage of African American players, and it was much more creative. It was a faster game. They were the first league to bring in the three-point line and things of this nature. So the ABA, however, did not necessarily find financial success going up against the NBA. And so in 1976, they decided to merge, and four teams from the ABA joined the NBA. And if you've ever heard of Dr. J, Julius Erving, perhaps one of the first true superstars of basketball, he was the first guy to dunk from the free throw line, for example. Um, he was a player in the ABA who joined the NBA. And people say if you had seen him play in the ABA, you would have thought he was the greatest player of all time. A lot of people say his years in the ABA, he was even better than Michael Jordan. So it's a shame that a lot of those games weren't necessarily recorded for posterity. In any event, it was a big deal because when we saw these two leagues merge, we saw the acceptance of a lot more African American players into the NBA, and indeed the pace and style of the game changed. And as I say, they bring in things like the three-point line, the dunk contest started in the ABA. All of these things that we associate with the NBA actually were influenced by the ABA. So it actually brought basketball into a more modern era, less, as I say, conservative with the way they did things in the ABA. And more than anything, it made it the way for what became the golden age of the NBA, which was the mid 1980s. Now, it did struggle from 1976 to about 1983, but by 1985, 1986, the NBA was going global. And we all know how that one turned out. Okay, and in 1991, on this day, South Africa got rid of its last apartheid laws. So only in 1991, this is within my lifetime, even though I'm very old, this is very, very recent that South Africa got rid of its last apartheid laws. Now, hopefully you've been paying attention in previous episodes, but if not, the apartheid era in South Africa was a time where there was specific laws limiting the rights of their black citizens and affording extra privileges or benefits to their white citizens, and of course, keeping black and white people separate. There were places that black people were not allowed to go, and there were technically places that white people, well, they were allowed to go, but they wouldn't go. So it kept the racial segregation, and it was dictated by law, by the state. You could absolutely get in trouble for breaking those laws. And the last of those laws was only repealed in 1991. Now, that is, as I say, within my lifetime, within my parents' lifetime, within my grandparents' lifetime. So this is one of the legacies of racial inequality, and they are still struggling with what they did in South Africa in terms of creating a state that was based on racism and how that did not work and how it played out economically going forward as well as politically going forward. So they're still dealing with those particular problems in South Africa, and it is very much within their recent memory and recent history. So another reason why, for example, it's an amazing thing that the Black Lives Matter movement is going global to help address global issues of racial inequality. Okay, time for the deep dive of the day, which is going to be looking at the French Revolution and this third estate proclaiming itself the National Assembly. Again, the point of on this day is to show how the past has influenced the present. So even though this is all the way back in 1789, this particular event, and of course the French Revolution as a whole, is still influencing the world of today, and in particular, the idea of power to the people. So, what exactly happened? Well, it was a transition from the Estates General to the National Assembly. So, first things first, what is the Estates General? This was the legislative body of France, sort of like a parliament-ish. So what would happen is when the king, who was in charge of everything in France, he was an absolute monarch, when the king was facing a particular crisis, he would call the meeting of the Estates General and they would give him advice. So the Estates General was merely an advisory body. They couldn't make laws necessarily, but the king would bring them together to seek their expert opinion on things. Now, this was called by Louis XVI to deal with a major financial crisis that France was happening, and so they met on May 5th in 1789. So the idea was, we are in trouble, we better ask the people what they want. Now, this is the way the Estates General worked. So there were the three estates of the realm. So this is why it's called the Estates General. Now, the first estate is made up of the clergy. So this is the bishops, the archbishops, and the priests of the country. The second estate is the nobility. So by this we mean, well, in English it would be the equivalent of the lords and the dukes. In French it is more the marquis, if you will, and the upper crust, the upper echelon, the aristocrats, the ruling class, if you will. And of course, the third estate, which is the commoners. So the third estate was granted double representation, twice as many delegates as the other estates. Now, this is a particularly interesting development. This decision by the king to allow the third estate to have double representation, there was mass protests going on in France. Now, isn't that amazing, the way that protests lead to political movements? Protests lead to direct consultation of how we can fix the situation, how we can calm the people down, how we can address their issues. So had it not been for the protests, the Estates General would not have been called. In fact, it had been over a century since there had been an Estates General. So the people were protesting in the streets because they were hungry, they were starving, they were poor. Now, one of the reasons he called the Estates General was to calm the people, to stop their protests, and to make it seem that he was definitely willing to listen to the people, to the commoners, to the workers, to the majority, which must be stressed, the third estate is the majority. He said, you can have twice the representation because I really care about my people, and I really care what you have to say. Now, that decision was made by the king to try and make it look like he wanted to hear what they had to say, but he didn't really. Allow me to explain. So, what ended up happening was, once this meeting begins of the Estates General, the king had also said, yes, you can have double the representation, but I'm still upholding the traditional voting by orders, which meant that what would happen is the clergy as a group would consult with each other and come up with their particular plan, and their vote would be worth one. So all members of the clergy would get a vote, which would come to one. Then the same thing would happen with the nobility. All members of the nobility would come together and decide what they wanted to vote, and their vote would count for one. And then everyone else, all the commoners and all of their representatives would come together, and they would decide what they wanted to do, and their vote would be for one, which meant even though they have double representation, they could easily be outvoted by the clergy and by the nobility if they decided against it. So say, for example, the people said, I think we should raise taxes on the nobility and the wealthy. The clergy might say, whoa, raising taxes, then we're quite wealthy, we don't want that. The nobility say, whoa, raising taxes, that means I pay money. No, we don't want that, that's not happening. So even though they've got double representation, their vote still counts for one. So if they'd done it the fair way, which would be each delegate having one vote, the majority would have been able to prevail, and that means the commoners, the people, would have been able to influence policy and procedure. So double representation was pretty much meaningless in terms of power. Now, this is important because once the third estate, the meeting began and the third estate realized this is what was happening, they got the word out to the people. They said, hey, even though the king has granted us double representation, he has not granted us any more power at all. He doesn't want to listen. He is lying. When he says he wants to listen and when he says he wants to make changes, he has in fact limited our ability to do that. So the king, the clergy, and the nobility were pretty satisfied. They thought they had limited the power of the people. They thought, it's okay, people have their delegates, let them have their fun, let them think they're having a say, and we'll just continue as we want. But the third estate had other ideas. So what ends up happening, by the time we get to June 17th, on this day, there was infighting and about the voting, about who was going to side with what, about who was going to make policy. So the third estate, remember, they've got double the representatives of everyone else. They simply said, forget you, we're not going to have an Estates General. We're not going to be the third estate at the Estates General. We will simply be the National Assembly. We were appointed, we were voted, we're here to represent the people. We will deliberate amongst ourselves and make the laws, because we will not be an assembly just of the estates. We're going to be assembly for the people, the actual people of the country of France. Now, they said to the other estates, you are welcome to join our National Assembly. So if you're a member of the aristocracy or a member of the clergy that wants things to change in France, that wants things to get better, come and join our National Assembly. If not, if you think everything's fine and if you don't want to make any changes, go away. We've got no use for you. We are going to make these rules. We're going to make the laws with or without you. So you can have a seat at the table or you can not come at all. But either way, we are doing this. Now, the king thought, I can't allow this to happen. So was the king's genius move. On the 20th of June, he said, we will close the hall where the National Assembly has been meeting. They can't get into the hall, they can't meet, they can't write laws, and nothing is going to change. So the Third Estate, or the now newly called National Assembly, decided to go and meet at an unlocked building, which happened to be a tennis court. Now, this is a very famous moment as well, and a very famous painting. If you've ever studied the French Revolution, I'm sure you've seen this before. And this is where they proceed to swear the tennis court oath, meaning they will not separate. They will not go back to their towns. They will not go back to their villages. They will not go back to their provinces until there is a settled constitution of France. They are going to write their laws down for the people, and it will be binding. Now, this was influenced by the fact that, as mentioned, France had been a key ally of the United States in the American Revolution. And a lot of the military leaders and diplomats that had been over in the United States at the foundation of their nation had seen that they had created a constitution. They had created a Bill of Rights. And they thought, why did we help a country to gain freedom for themselves and create all of these documents when we don't have those documents? That was one thing that was happening. But also, Britain at this time had been living under a constitutional monarchy. Their king in Britain had his powers limited by the law, and Britain was building a very successful empire, of course. And so France came to realize that, hang on a second, we don't need to have a king with absolute power in order to be successful. Britain doesn't, and they have so much more power than we have. So obviously the system works better, not just for the people, but for the empire as well. So this is everything that was going on in terms of trying to create this constitution. It was to make France better, but not just for the people, but in order to strengthen the country and strengthen the nation and strengthen the empire as well. So Louis XVI had failed to sabotage the assembly by rigging the votes, and he had failed to keep the Third Estate, or the National Assembly, from meeting. So the Estates General is gone. No one's listening to what they have to say anymore. Those meetings are not taking place. Now it is the National Assembly, and now it is the delegates of the Third Estate, remember, the people representing the commoners, that were dictating policy. How is this so relevant for today? Gee, I don't know, a popular movement that started with protests that wanted reform, and there was resistance to that reform, but the people in such large numbers couldn't be ignored, and therefore reform ends up taking place. Yes, highly, highly relevant to today. Now, this process, as I say, the declaration of the National Assembly is by some historians seen to be the beginning of the French Revolution, and it has had a profound effect on the world today. For example, this phrase, which you may have heard before, either in French, which I'm not going to attempt because my French is terrible, or in English, equality, liberty, and fraternity, fraternity meaning brotherhood. And so this was the idea that you do not have these absolute monarchs, these kings that can do whatever they want. Everyone is going to be equal before the law. Everyone is going to have their freedoms. No one is going to be beholden to their local lord in a feudal system that had been the hallmark of the Middle Ages, for example. And fraternity, brotherhood, nationhood. Now, this is a big, big deal, especially in terms of its positive and negative aspects. But the idea was you do not have loyalty to your king necessarily. So you don't fight for your king anymore. You start having loyalty to your nation, to your people, to your brothers, And yes, it was, of course, always dictated in terms of the role of the man, not necessarily including the role of the woman, which is a whole nother thing. But in any event, they were starting to make progress. Okay, this was better than the old system than before. But the idea was you didn't necessarily just do what your king told you, you did what was best for your country, for your nation, for your brothers, for your country people. Okay, so that idea became much more popular. And even though the National Assembly was declared by the members of the Third Estate, and it was just the commoners, in actual fact, many members of the clergy and the nobility started to join this Third Estate in the National Assembly because they also wanted reform. They also saw its benefits. And for some, that meant, hang on, if we don't join this National Assembly, we'll be seen as enemies of the people, and if a revolution and violence breaks out, then we'll be the first to go. We should probably be on the right side of history here. So some of them joined for that reason. But a lot of them started to join thinking like, yes, this is going to make our nation better. It's going to make our nation stronger. We're going to be able to modernize. We're going to be able to make ourselves better. And they joined the movement. There was, of course, still many people in the nobility and many people in the clergy who did not necessarily join the movement because they wanted things to stay exactly the same, which of course you would if you were in an unfair system, but you were on the the beneficial side of that system. So, for example, uh, there's $100 or £100 to split up, and you're getting 90 of it, and everyone else has to share the 10. That's completely and utterly unfair. But some people might say, well, sure, this is unfair, but I'm the one getting the 90, so I'm cool with that. Now, there were still many members of the clergy, many members of the nobility that wanted things to stay the same because of that exact reason. They did not want equality because they were above everyone else. They didn't want liberty, freedoms, because they were the ones who were keeping people under their control, keeping people on their lands, charging people taxes. Any liberty from that standpoint would be bad for them financially. And of course, the idea of fraternity, well, I don't want everyone to be loyal to each other. I want them to be loyal to me, their local lord. Or I want them to be loyal to the king so that when I tell the king to pass whatever taxes and he does, they'll pay them. Things of this nature. So there were still people that didn't want equality, liberty, and fraternity. You can imagine if you are doing really, 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 really well under an unfair system, as soon as someone proposes the idea of making it fair, you go, well, I'm going to lose so much if it becomes fair. So I'm happy with it being unfair. Okay, so that's purely selfishness on their end. Um, so one of the biggest things that ended up coming out of the National Assembly actually happened a few months later. They got together and they created something called the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Now, again, the idea of this being man instead of everyone, that's a whole separate debate. But at the time, this was considered to be quite a progressive move forward. This was saying that every single man in the nation had equal rights. Now, this idea of people being equal, people having particular rights owed to them, just because of the fact that they were a citizen of the nation, not because they were born into a particular family, not because they were favored by the king, but simply because they were French, simply because they were of the nation, simply because they were part of the fraternity, part of the that whole brotherhood. They were granted inherent rights. Now that idea had already been espoused in the American Constitution and the American Bill of Rights, for example, but this was the first time it had been attempted to be implemented in Europe. And of course, what happens in Europe, therefore, when Europe has control of much of the world through their colonies, a lot of the political ideas of Europe go around the world. So it's a very, very important event that the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen happens in France, because those ideas start spreading around Europe, and from Europe, they start spreading around the world. Because America pretty much wouldn't be spreading their ideas of politics for the next century. So until they had this war with Spain, which has been talked about in previous videos, but we're not talking about that today. So the idea of inalienable certain rights being granted to you because you are a citizen, because you are a person, in this case a man, but we'll talk about that in other videos. That was a brand new idea. That was a huge idea. And the spreading of those ideas around Europe sort of started to create the more liberal, that's where we get the idea, liberty, liberal, more liberal ideas of people being able to be equal, people being able to have equal opportunities for things like employment, education, all of these ideas. Now, that does not mean that in August of 1789, they all of a sudden realized um, that women were the equal of men, or that there was no more classes or anything like that. Of course not. History, unfortunately, shows us that there are many opportunities for change, and people are only capable of accepting a certain level of change. So to go from the king's in charge of you and you're essentially a slave to feudalism, if you will, you're essentially do whatever your lord tells you, to the modern ideas of freedom and equality of no matter what your religion, race, or gender, that would be far too drastic of a change for it to have occurred to the people at the time, and far too drastic a change for it to be sustainable. So we can look at this as a stepping stone towards the modern world, but it was not indeed uh, all the way there yet. So just keep that in mind. It is possible to say they made some good progress and they built the foundations for more progress to come, but unfortunately, in 1789, they weren't necessarily able to get their society as progressive and forward as we are in 2020. In the same way that the ideas we have in 2020 were not necessarily the accepted ideas of the year, even 2000. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so with all of that said, I hope you have learned something today. I hope that you have indeed started to see that violent protest often precedes political change. So therefore, we don't necessarily always need to say that violent protest serves no purpose, because of course it has had quite an influence throughout history. And indeed, it was the cause or the catalyst, if you will, for the beginning of change, the beginning of the French Revolution, and the ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.